It seems that no matter where we are not safe from the monsters that go bump in the night. The creepy voices you hear coming from the woods, the shadows that you think are just part of your imagination. There's something lurking just outside the light. Today, 10 people send me their allegedly true encounters with Wendigos and Skinwalkers. Better lock all your doors and windows tonight and tuck in real tight, because the Wendigo's coming for you tonight. I've been listening to your videos a lot recently. My story has a few characteristics as the other stories on your channel. I'm an urban native from Casa Grande, and I'm a member of the Gila River Indian community in south central Arizona. My older brother moved back to the reservation just last summer when his new house was complete. His house is in the middle of 2 fields and is walking distance from 2 graveyards. Here's another thing about where the house is. During the same time as my story takes place, one of the neighbor's grandchildren hung himself in a tree close by, and one of our cats disappeared. Anyway, I was staying at my brother's house during my Christmas break. I was home alone with our cat. I was getting ready to go back to school. As I was putting my clothes into the suitcase and listening to some music, I heard someone knocking on our front door. I usually hear cars coming up or people walking around, but I doubted anyone would be walking around the reservation at night, unless they were drunk or high. The walls of the house are thin to me. I could hear someone walking in the front of the house, and then there was knocking on my window. I'm a superstitious person, so, of course, I got a bit freaked out. I have a habit of leaving window blinds open, so I looked out. There was probably something out there, but I didn't see it. Immediately, I closed the blinds I left open around the house and checked to see if the doors were locked. I went to find my cat, Ruth, so I knew she was safe. I sat in the living room with her and waited for my family. Again, there was a knocking on one of the windows. I prayed that my family would come home soon. Half an hour later, the truck pulled into the driveway. I opened the door to welcome them back. I told my brother about what happened. He didn't really say anything because he wasn't sure what it was either. Later on that night, I woke up around maybe 1 or 2 a.m. Midnight to 3 a.m. are considered witching hours here. It wasn't windy or anything outside, but out of nowhere there was high-pitched loud wailing. I rolled into a ball on the couch and prayed some more. I wish I had some sage or cedar at the time. My story isn't really exciting, I know, but I'm telling it as I remember. My heart still pounds as I write about it. I should also mention that Ruth has also left since then. So this happened back in the summer of 2009. I was 20 years old at the time, living in a rural area of the Pacific Northwest. I was jumping between jobs at the time and ended up as a caretaker for a vineyard. My duties were to basically water the plants when need be and keep deer out of the field. I owned a camper at the time, because housing was, and still is, fucked. So, I towed it out to the vineyard and had it tucked away in a corner of the property that was less frequented, for peace and quiet reasons. There was a big forested hillside by this section of the property, and blackberry bushes had overtaken most of everything else. Which was nice, because they were in bloom, and it was an endless snack. I had been working this job since the previous summer, and had never really had anything out of the ordinary happen, but that all changed one night. So this happened sometime in the late evening. I was relaxing after a hard day's work and watching a movie. Probably Pineapple Express or Step Brothers, being as I was obsessed with those movies at the time. It seemed just like any other day. There was a window directly to my left in the camper that I would glance out every once in a while, just out of plain paranoia. I had it open that night to let cool air in. I could start to hear something moving very rapidly through the brush at the top of the hill, which was a good 400 yards or so away. I paused the movie in order to hear better. The movement became louder as this thing was clearly moving down the hill. It sounded massive, breaking sticks and kicking up leaves. I had assumed it was a bear. It audibly approaches the bottom of the hill, which was a lot closer to my camper, about 50 yards. I then heard the screams of an animal. It sounded like it was in pain, shrieking and gargling very loudly. This sound was absolutely terrifying. I had never heard it before, and I grew up in the woods, but it definitely was not human. I then heard what I thought sounded like bones snapping as the shrieking slowly died down to a low gurgle. Something was being devoured, or so I thought. I now think this was a skinwalker trying to lure me out. Anyways, the creature emerged from the tree line and began coming in my direction of the camper. I knew this because I could feel the vibrations of the footsteps in the ground through my camper. They were clearly bipedal as well, meaning the beast was walking on 2 legs. I have never been more terrified than in that moment. Feeling the footsteps meant it was real. I closed my window and all the curtains and turned everything off. I sat in darkness as the thing got closer, now circling my camper and bumping it. I had no protection. I felt it circle around my window and stop there. It tapped on it once, not a soft tap, but a loud, silence-breaking thud. I jumped back and nearly started shouting, but I knew not to let it scare me. Then, the camper started rocking back and forth vigorously. I knew I had to act now or else this thing was going to tip it over. I had a pretty impressive stereo set up in there, and the only thing I could think of was to be as loud as possible and I was scared away. I quickly plugged my MP3 player in and cranked it to the volume. I hit shuffle. I didn't care that if whatever it played, I just needed it to be noise. Pulse of the Maggots by Slipknot began to play, one of my favorites to this day. Now, I don't know if I scared this thing away or if it realized that I'm just as fucked up as it is. All I know is that it worked, because just a little bit after I hit play, the creature stopped rocking my camper. I didn't listen to see if it went away though. I finished up the night blasting music until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. The next morning, I could see dents in the side of the camper, and a clear trail going up the hillside. I searched for any animal remains to explain the shrieking, but I found none. I finished out the summer at that job and was never bothered again, but I ended up leaving anyway. This being one of the reasons for leaving. I truly have no idea what this thing was. I never got a look at it, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't. To give you a little more insight about me, this story happened when I was 14 years old. I was at my friend Emily's house, since back then I lived there for personal reasons. Anyways, it was about 1 AM, and her parents were gone for the night at her grandmother's house. We were watching horror movies and vegging out on snacks like we usually would every weekend night. After our movie, I got up to pee and let her know I'd be back. She nodded before opening up her laptop to message her boyfriend at the time. As I walked down her barely lit hallway and came across the bathroom, I heard Emily's voice call out to me from her back porch that was on the right side of the hallway, which immediately struck me as odd because I didn't see her leave the room, so to me I was a little confused. Why would she be outside anyway? Her voice called to me again, so I couldn't help but walk out to the back porch. It took a lot to scare me, so I wasn't bothered by this. Turned out to be the biggest mistake ever. A red flag should have went off, right then and there when her voice became silent as I stepped onto the porch. I called her name softly, but she didn't reply. I called her name once more, but this time louder, and again, silence. I stepped off the porch and stepped onto the grass. I was looking for her in her wooded backyard, a little pissed now because at the time I figured she was trying to pull a prank on me, like she would usually do. It was pretty normal for her to do this, but when I yelled her name again, a voice spoke, but it wasn't hers. It was another woman's voice. Help me, please! For the love of God! Help me! I heard a woman scream. Okay, now I was officially freaked out, because there was no one around for miles besides her one neighbor that lives a little ways into the woods. I found myself not being able to move. Curiosity maybe, but the bushes started rustling, and what looked like a dog stepped out. My first thought was this was maybe the neighbor's dog that must have gotten out, because this has happened before. But when this thing stood up on its hind legs, it was about 7 feet tall. That's when I really froze up. What the hell was this thing? I asked myself over and over. I never met any human that was that tall in my entire life. When it started to stalk towards me, I freaked out instantly. It was walking like a human, but like wobbling like a baby taking its first steps. I found myself not being able to bolt out of there like I should have. I couldn't move. That is until I heard the slider door begin to open and the real Emily's voice speak. Lana, what are you doing out here? As soon as she finished that sentence, I bolted as fast as I could and pulled my friend inside before shutting the door and locking it while closing the blinds. I did this to every room and to every door. When she realized how terrified I was and how badly I was shaking, only then did she ask me, Jesus, Lana, what's the matter? You look like you just seen a ghost. What the hell happened? I finally calmed down enough to begin telling her what I encountered. But before I got the chance to fully explain what happened, I heard an extreme banging on my friend's window, which stunned us both as we both shot up into the air at least 10 feet. I whispered fuck when I realized I forgot to shut her blinds. I didn't have the heart to turn around, but when Emily's face went pale, I didn't have a choice but to look behind me. I really wish I hadn't. There that thing was, looking into our bedroom window. I couldn't even begin to explain what it looked like. All I came up with is that his body was twisted, like it was just not human. It looked like it had been in some freakish kind of a car accident. It had fur, lots of it, and his eyes glowed much like a cat. A high-pitched noise escaped that thing's throat, making us only cover our ears, but we both screamed as hard as we could until our lungs would not scream anymore. I threw my friend on the floor before zooming into her parents' room to get her dad's .42 rifle. But when I came back, the thing was gone and the noise had stopped. We moved the next day to my family's vacation home in a very populated city with little to no trees. When my parents got home, we told them everything, and they had the same reactions. They told us that we could never go out after dark alone anymore, and to stay away from wooded areas. Of course, I never questioned it, and to this day I don't know if it was a skinwalker, but a lot of people around here believe in it. A year or so ago, I left England for the summer in order to travel a bit and maybe find some work abroad for a few months. I managed to stumble across a decently paying job as a farmhand in the northwestern area of the Navajo Reservation in New Mexico. The farmer was looking for somebody to help him with busy work over the summer and allowed me to sleep in what I can only describe as a cabin. Basically, a big shed he had renovated in order to house whoever he had working for him at the moment. It was a large farmland, and the shed was situated pretty much parallel to the house across his largest field of crops. Living in this shed with me was a half Native American boy who was about the same age as me. His name was Ahiga. Anyway, I arrived at the cabin after a long and stressful journey by plane, and then pretty much hitchhiking my way across the USA. I met the farmer and the boy, and they both seemed friendly enough. Everything was smooth sailing for around 2 weeks, even with the relentless heat bearing down on my pale English skin. Ahiga and I became close as we were around each other 24/7. He would always tell me interesting stories of Navajo legend. He often told me of the Yeenad Lushi, or skinwalkers. He would tell me about them in detail. He seemed very knowledgeable on the subject. He told me how he dreamed of these creatures often. It seemed like he had some kind of morbid obsession with these things. I chalked it up to the horror stories and didn't really put any stock into what he was saying. Although, it did interest me. I've never been one to believe or fear the supernatural. One evening, after a heavy day of work, I headed back to the cabin to shower and change. I got back to the cabin, showered, got changed, and sat down on my bed. There was no sign of Ahiga yet, which was weird because he would usually be there before I was. I waved it off and left the cabin, and went to head to the nearest town, just to explore a bit and to see more of the land that I was staying in. I explored for a while and found a nearby bar to drink in, as I hadn't had a single drink since moving here. I left the bar at around 10:30 p.m. and was pretty much fully dark. I began to walk back to the farm. As I was walking back to the farm along this windy road, I felt as if I was being watched. I walked on a bit faster and made my way across to the farm. As I walked around the farmer's house, I noticed what looked like someone carrying a bag under their arm, leaving my cabin. Something felt and looked not right about this figure and its movements. I went stealth mode, almost instinctively, and took the long way around the field, hiding behind the fencing. I managed to get a good angle on the figure. As he stood up, the light shining from the cabin illuminated what I saw. I saw that it was Ahiga. At first, I was relieved, but then I saw how erratically he was moving, almost with no rhythm at all. Under his arm he clutched a dog's severed head. I felt sick to my stomach and ducked down, but managed to compose myself. I poked my head up to check once more, and he was heading off into the forest. I took this opportunity to dart to the cabin and pull my keys out to unlock the door. As I got close, I tripped and dropped my keys and thundered to the ground. I propelled myself back up and turned to see what I can only describe as the rest of the beheaded dog. I swung around to look to the woods and saw Ahiga on all fours, not like an animal, but like a person with their arms and legs bent in the wrong direction. It felt as if he was looking directly into my soul. He had 2 yellow glowing eyes and a confused look on his face. "I am Ahiga," I think he tried to say, but the words were guttural and frothy, almost like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. I unlocked the door and bolted inside, locking it behind me and closing all the curtains and windows in the cabin. I sat awake all night, hearing voices and feeling watched somehow. I'd hear whatever it was at the door every now and again, pretending to be Ahiga. It would repeat parts of stories Ahiga had been telling me whenever we relaxed in the cabin together on previous nights, and every time it showed up, a horrific smell filled the cabin and made me vomit a few times. In the end, the harassment stopped when the daylight began. I checked out the window and saw nothing outside. I quickly gathered all my possessions and got the fuck out of there. I flew back to England the next week after using all my farmhand money to rent a hotel room on the East Coast, as far away from that place as I could. Let me go ahead and say that I believe in the paranormal, like ghosts, demons, etc. However, I have always had a hard time believing in monsters like vampires, ghouls, etc. Though I do believe in Native American monsters like the skinwalkers, wendigo, etc. The reason I am saying this is because I am stumped as to what is going on in my hometown, and it only happens during the full moon. These past full moons have bared cats that were killed. Sinister happenings, namely the massacres of pets and livestock. 2 full moons ago, mine and 3 of my neighbors' cats were mutilated. I never saw my cat's body after being freshly killed, but I did see it while it was decomposing. It was not pretty. As for my neighbor's cats, I saw the fresh corpses. They were torn apart in a very brutal fashion. Of course, where I live, in Florida, we have panthers, bears, and coyotes, red wolves, etc. So it is not all that crazy of an idea that one of these predators just got hungry. However, I found out a few days later that it wasn't just our cats, but several other people had dead cats. And the only connection was that all these cats had been outside on the night of the moon. Also, no dogs were killed, which I find slightly strange as well. Now, getting to the massacre during the last full moon, one of my friends who lives 5 minutes away from me owns goats, 10 goats to be exact. This past moon, all of them were killed. No evidence of what did it, just 10 torn apart goats. We looked for evidence, but being that it rained that night, any footprints that had been there vanished away by the rain. Whatever did this must have been fool, since there were no killings that I knew of. I feel like I am living in a horror movie right now. I don't understand what is killing these animals, but it is very vicious. It may just be a pack of coyotes or a very vicious panther, but I consider a creature like a werewolf to be the culprit. My father and I were camping in a semi-remote area when I was about 7. We spent the day setting up camp, where he showed me how to assemble the tent and how to bait a fishing hook. I slipped and fell into the camp water that we were fishing, and I remember hearing my dad yell my name several times before I surfaced. The water wasn't very deep, and I pulled myself onto the rocks with the help of my dad. About an hour later, it's getting dark and my dad builds a big fire. He excuses himself, as I assume he went to take a pee, and I'm all alone. I sat listening to the crackling of the fire when I heard a voice call my name from the wooded area that we had walked through earlier. It wasn't a shout, but the inflection and tone was the exact same as my father's earlier. But it did not sound like my dad. I remember how confused I felt. For all intents and purposes, it had to be my dad. But something was very off. I heard my name again, this time closer, and I almost walked over to it, because who else would know my name out here? Right as I'm about to walk over, I see my dad walking out of the adjacent woods, and I asked if he called to me. He said no, and I thought he was messing with me, so I let it go. The next day I got really sick and we packed up and left, and I haven't thought of that in years. I saw something on TV that reminded me of that. Anyways, I thought I'd share. My name is Paul. I live in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I have always believed in the paranormal and cryptid since I was a kid. I never experienced anything strange until recent years. For more backstory, I just turned 19. I'm a male, standing about 6'8" and weighing in at 260 pounds. So, I'm a fairly big guy, and nothing scares me really. What does scare me though, are stories of skinwalkers and the Dog Man. I have heard stories from my indigenous friends for a while now of a creature known as the Rougarou. I have heard of it before from documentaries, so I had an idea of what it was. I never doubted their stories. One time, I remember that it was stalking one of my friends' homes on their reservation. She was down the block from her house when she saw it, but I don't remember the details that well. She told me a long time ago. If you guys want, I'll have her write it down and I'll submit it to the channel. But my story begins about 3 years ago. So, when I was about 16, around the end of summer, I was at a friend's house. We were just hanging out and playing video games. We stayed up until about 1 or 2 in the morning, but I had to get home because I had to do things the next day. I rode my bike over to his house, so I had to get home using that. I lived 30 minutes away, but to me on bike that's like 10 minutes if I ride the paths that I take home. It takes me down this really long street that's basically a straight shot to my house. To the left of me is a really big park. It's not lit at all, and on the right, there are houses. I've always felt like I was being watched in that area, especially near the park with no lights. It's always pitch black at night, even in the city. I always bike there by myself, and nothing ever happens. But this night was different. I could feel it. I felt like I was being stalked, so I started biking faster. My bike is a double disc, so it's not a slow bike by any means, and I swear to God I looked over at the park and saw what seemed to be a dog running at me. But it was much bigger than any dog I've ever seen in the area, so I started pedaling away. I started pedaling harder and harder, and I threw my bike's gear all the way up to 8 and went my fastest, never stopping. But I never heard it running beside me in the park, like it didn't want to be in the light. I got to the end of the street and turned onto the sidewalk that went under these train tracks. I looked behind me. It stopped under the tracks and stared at me as I biked away, but I got a good look at it, and my heart sank. It was now standing on its hind legs, and just standing there, at the point did I see that this is no dog. It was bulging with muscles, and it had a human shape, but with a dog head and legs, its arms were the scariest. They were long and had dagger-like claws. Its breathing was ragged from running along beside me for so long. The look it gave me was pure vile. It was a mix of hatred and hunger, like it hated my existence. Its fur was darkish yellow, maybe light brown. It looked like how dead grass looks, all withered and dying. I got home in about 2 minutes after that. I was cutting cars off and running lights on my bike. I never biked by there at night again. I'm too scared. I now know what is out there. I live in the prairie, and it camouflaged itself perfectly in the tall prairie grass. I never told anybody this. I'm mostly afraid because no one would believe me. But I think it was a dogman or maybe the Rougarou that my friends told me about. But after researching that, I found out that people's pets were disappearing from the area at the same time that I saw what I think was this dogman. I'm 26 now, and living in Pennsylvania, but when I was growing up, I lived in Montpelier, Vermont. My summers were spent hiking mountains, swimming in lakes, and exploring expansive forests. I knew that my state had bears and rattlesnakes in its more secluded, mountainous regions, but I never imagined that there was anything more terrifying than those out there. When I was 19, my friend Emily and I went to Moss Glen Falls for a day of swimming and picnicking, and it gave us a nice change of scenery from campus. The waterfall is located in Stow, which is a remote town in Vermont that has a population of barely 4,000. Emily was from another state and had never really seen much of the area beyond our college campus, so I figured showing her some of Vermont's quaint locations was in order. The day was perfect. We had packed plenty of food, sunscreen, and towels, and since it was a weekday afternoon, there was no one else at the falls except for an elderly couple who left not long after we got there. We spread our towels out on a large rock by the falls and alternated between climbing up the waterfall edges to get to the swimming pools and relaxing in the late afternoon sun. It was peaceful, and it was the perfect break for a long day of homework and classes. As the day wore on, Emily wanted to explore some of the trails near the falls. I was familiar with a few of them, and I tried to keep her on those. What I didn't account for was that she would insist on exploring some of the more outlying trails, and that we would consequently get lost. We spent nearly an hour walking in circles, our arms and legs getting covered in mosquito bites, and our bathing suits drying uncomfortably onto our skin. We had the flashlights in our phones to give us a little light once the sun set, but they didn't do much to illuminate the dense undergrowth shrouding both sides of the trail. Finally, we came across a blackberry patch that we were pretty sure we had seen earlier, so by logical default, we started heading down the path closest to the bushes. Emily kept asking me if I heard twigs snapping behind us, and I brushed it off as a city girl being afraid of deer or rabbits. I didn't hear anything myself, so I figured she was feeling paranoid, due to it being her first time lost in the woods. Then I heard it. The noise came from somewhere behind us, and it was too loud to be a small animal like a rabbit. I figured it was another person out walking, or maybe a herd of deer passing through. Stow has never been a populous town, and the locals could argue that there's more deer here than people. I ignored the uneasy feeling building in the pit of my stomach and kept walking, chalking it up to my friend's paranoia rubbing off on me, and I babbled senselessly about cute guys to keep Emily and I distracted. After about 10 minutes of walking back to the car, we finally came in sight of the trailhead. There was a large boulder where the plaque was on it, dedicated to a young woman who had been murdered at the falls back in 1991, and right beyond that was my car. As we neared the boulder, relief evident on Emily's face, a weird noise came from the woods behind us. It sounded almost like a cat, but it was distorted and static, like it was coming out of an old radio. My first instinct was the fact that the cat was wounded or in danger. I've always been an animal lover, and if there was a hurt cat, I wasn't about to leave it out there to become a coyote snack. I turned around, ignoring Emily begging me to just get in the car, and peered back into the trail. I gave Emily the keys and told her to get our towels, now that we knew where we were, and I promised I'd be back momentarily. If I didn't find the cat right away, I wasn't going to spend forever looking for it, but I couldn't just drive away either. With the loss of the second flashlight, the woods seemed to be a bit more eerie to me, and the darkness was nagging at my peripheral vision. I walked a little ways down the path as I called to the cat, hoping to locate it by its meow, but I didn't hear anything for several moments. I was about to give up when I heard a low, out-of-place laugh behind me. I spun around, my heart beating way too fast, but all I saw was a large buck. I remember muttering something stupid, sneaky deer. Then I headed back to the trailhead. That was when the deer laughed again, and I froze. The harsh sound was completely unnatural. For those of you who do not know, deer don't make sounds like that, they just make grunts. They don't make any sort of laughter-like noises, and even if they did, it wouldn't have the same cadence as a human's laugh would. And as this deer, it had a human laugh. This situation was weird and unnerving, and I kept hoping that someone will pop their head out from around a tree and tell me it was a prank. That didn't happen though. The deer took a few steps towards me, and then that odd cat sound came from it. I almost literally threw my hands up in a nope gesture, and I just started walking away from it as quickly as I could. I was almost in sight of the end of the trail when I felt something snag my hair. I swatted it away, thinking it was a branch since there was a lot of low-hanging trees along the trail, but the sensation turned instantly. I reached up to tug my hair free, but it wouldn't come loose. I turned to face the offending tree, my heart thumping in shock. The deer was now on its hind legs. It had my hair caught in one of its antler points. The snarls from a day of swimming and hiking were entangled around its antler. All I could do was just stand there as I felt its cold breath on my face. It was not warm, and it was not hot, but icy cold breath reefed around me. I let out the most shrill scream I had ever heard myself make, and I violently yanked my hair off its antlers. I sprinted for my car, screaming the whole way for Emily to start it. I heard the engine turn when I neared the boulder, and she didn't hesitate to floor it as soon as I was in the car. The tears streaming down my face were enough motivation. She didn't question me until we were nearly 5 miles from Moss Glen. I told her about the weird noises and the deer getting up in my face. I told her it startled me, and that on top of that, the stress of being lost was just enough to make me panic. She bought my explanation, agreeing that we were both super tired, and adding that my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I haven't returned to Stow since then, even though I have visited Vermont recently. I know there's probably some sort of rational explanation for what I saw and what I heard that night, but I haven't been able to find what that could be.